Hello, this is EDF4004, Week 3 on Assessment Skills and Techniques. Now I just want to make a few kind of notes about traditional versus authentic versus performance assessment, particularly because we've discussed those and we'll probably discuss them in the first assessment task, but it's discussed in the book and we will be doing some tutorial tasks related to this. Now, a lot of this is already in your textbook, but I just wanted to just briefly go over this. We have traditional assessments, which is often norm reference, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail later on in this lecture, but norm reference is this idea that it's based on a larger population, and we're comparing student scores in a way. So it's very much referenced by, what an average student might have on this test or might receive on this test. Traditional assessments, we often associate standardized tests and that there's a single correct answer. When we think of traditional assessments, we often think of it's about the mastery of a particular subject or content versus problem solving, research, and discussion. Authentic assessments, on the other hand, we have several different types. So in your book, it discusses performance assessments and also product assessments. And those are all kind of subsets of authentic assessment. So performance assessments is where there is actually a performance, students perform a task, and that performance is assessed. And product assessments are things like portfolios, so students actually create something. But authentic assessments, in contrast to traditional assessments, is this idea that it's assessed within context. So it's within a particular and real life context. So that idea of authenticity. It's problem based, so students are using their problem solving skills. And it's competence based, so showing competence in real life scenarios. Now, I would just have a look at your book in regards to these, and particularly when you're preparing for your first assignment, being able to discuss when you're talking about your assessment task and whether it's an authentic or whether it's a traditional test or assessment, being able to describe what that actually means. We're going to look at some test techniques. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into all of these, particularly because there are some great examples in your textbook that give examples of each of these 9 different test techniques, all the way from multiple choice to interviews and conferences. So please do look at Brady and Kennedy, because it is a very good resource in providing examples of what these different test techniques are. And the thing I think that's important to notice is that often as teachers we get used to a particular technique and then we use it all the time. And the idea is that if we're going to use tests, which tests definitely have a place in the classroom, there's different techniques that you can use, which is important just to provide a bit of variety. Now I'm going to talk a lot about multiple choice questions, and partly because we do tend to use them and see them a lot in student assessment. Now, multiple choice questions seem quite easy in regards to scoring them, but actually constructing multiple choice questions can be quite difficult. So I'm going to kind of walk through some of the things that you should avoid when creating multiple choice questions. Now, one of the biggest challenges is creating distractors. So when we talk about multiple choice questions, we have the stem, and that's the actual kind of question. And then you have options, one being the correct answer, and then the others being distractors. Now, a good distractor will attract the attention of learners who do not know the answer, as opposed to tricking those who actually do know the answer. And that's difficult when you're trying to construct these questions, is deciding, is this distractor good in attracting those who do not know the answer, or is it actually tricking those who do actually know the answer? So that's an important thing to consider when you're creating multiple choice questions. The other thing is that the options, the correct answer, and the distractors need to assess just one objective, not several, and I'll give an example of that in just a minute. So some features to avoid: repetition. So there's no need to require excess reading. So in the stem, most of the words should appear there. So if you see in this example, not to tell, not to having told, not to be telling, you can put not to in the stem. So Tom ought not to, and then so on. So no need to continue to repeat words within the distractors or the options. Length or difficulty. Options should be relatively the same length and difficulty. So in this example, you have just one word, study, sleep, or read, and then you have understand the complexities of constructing multiple choice questions and explaining the value. So you can, obviously that kind of raises a flag to students and saying, well, okay, is the reason why this is different because it's right, or is it because it's this nonsense distractor? So try to keep the options the same length and difficulty. Try not to give students clues. So students shouldn't be able to answer the question just based on common knowledge or prior knowledge. So for example, if it's a reading text and they have to read the text, and they can answer it without actually having to read the text. So try to make sure that they can't answer it just by common knowledge. And that also, you have to be careful because you can discriminate with students who may, for example, if there are students and you're asking a question that really is based on living in Australia, that they could answer it because they've lived in Australia, and you have international students that come in. Obviously, that's going to benefit those who live in Australia and have lived in Australia and might have that prior knowledge. Make sure that the distractors, so not the options, but the distractors are, that you don't have two distractors that are similar. So, for example, if there's two distractors that are similar, and the student realizes, okay, that's definitely not one of the options, and this one's similar, so they can already eliminate both. So their probability of choosing the correct answer is much higher, which isn't a bad thing if they know the correct answer. But if they don't know the correct answer, they can just use this process of elimination. And if you've already kind of made it easy for them, they can choose the correct answer and actually not know the correct answer. Make sure that you don't give them information in previous questions, so you can get the answer from a previous question. And then there's also this idea of convergence, and that means that the one answer seems to be the center from which all other distractors vary. So with this multiple choice question, you have these people once had fame and fortune, now blank is left for them. So you see that they're all quite similar, and they all start with, all but D start with all. So this idea that, there's one answer that seems to, all other answers kind of come from that. So try to avoid that. Mixed response, this is the idea that two objectives are being assessed at once. And in this case, so again, I'm a language person, so apologies for always having examples from this, but in this case, it is basically trying to assess students' knowledge of vocabulary and grammar. So Jill insinuated that Bill was lying. Now, because it's in the past tense, they have to decide, well, does this word need to be in the past tense? And then it's also trying to figure out if they know the vocabulary. So just try to assess one thing at a time. So in this, it's looking at also students' ability to answer correctly in regards to their vocabulary knowledge and also the grammar. So try to just do one, not both. Other things to consider are nonsense distractors, and sometimes I do put some in, but one that definitely is not the case, okay? And sometimes we like to, as teachers, we like to put some of those in, but if you don't have many distractors in general, then it's obviously going to really affect the validity of the test, because if students are able to, because there's so many nonsense distractors, they don't actually know the correct answer, but the test is saying that they do. So there's a validity issue there. So try to avoid some nonsense distractors unless you have lots of distractors. So you have 5 or 6 distractors, and so you have 1 nonsense distractor. Obviously check that you don't have more than 1 correct answer, and that seems like obvious, but sometimes these things happen, and my suggestion is that you trial. If you're using a multiple choice test, it's really difficult to create good multiple choice questions, so do trial it. Just make sure, have someone read it or look at it, have someone take it, make sure that you haven't actually created something that has 2 answers or there is no correct answer. And then also try not to have a predetermined pattern. So let's say you continue to do A, B, C, D, A, B, C. So the correct answer is A, and then the next one is B, it's C, because students can be good pattern guessers. And if you do create a pattern with the answers, some of them can clue on to that. So how many distractors? So you could have 2 distractors, so that means 3 options, but that means that there's a 33% chance that a random guess will be correct. Now, what is fairly standard is to have 3 distractors or 4 options, so A, B, C, and D, and that's 25% of a random guess being corrected. And the final is probably the best option, but it does require a lot more options, and that's difficult. So that's 4 distractors, 5 options, so 20% of a random guess being correct. Now, I'll talk briefly about authentic assessment strategies. And again, I won't go into much detail because Brady and Kennedy do cover this in the textbook. So anecdotal records, checklists, rating skills, portfolios, exhibitions, and projects. So do have a look and look at the examples that Brady and Kennedy give for those. And these are ways to assess. So they're, like checklists are a great way for not only teachers to use it, but also for peer assessment and self-assessment as well. Now I'm trying to fly through these. I'm trying to make these as content heavy as possible, but not very long. So the final thing I want to kind of mention when creating tests and techniques is to consider the characteristics or distinctions. And these kind of run as a continuum and things to consider when you are creating tests. So there's this continuum of how directly direct to more indirect. So basically it's the idea of how does the test, does the test task obviously reflect the ability being tested? So it's directly assessing it, more indirectly assessing it. So with direct testing, it samples explicitly. So it involves the students in practicing the skill being assessed. So the students are actually doing what they're being assessed on, and that doesn't quite make sense, but so for example an oral interview, so they're actually being assessed on their oral language. So this oral interview is a very direct way of assessing that, and it tends to be a bit more authentic. Or an essay, so they're actually writing and their writing is being assessed. We have more indirect techniques when we're thinking about testing, and that's when students perform tasks that theoretically underlie or correlate with ability, or students do something else which shows how well they can do the task itself. And those are things like closed tests and multiple choice. So those are a bit more indirect. Now, mostly direct testing tends to be much more difficult and is not as practical. Not more difficult, it's just not as practical as indirect testing. So with closed tests and multiple choice, it is much easier to score and takes much, it doesn't take as much time. So there is this continuum from direct to more indirect testing, and those are decisions you have to make when you're constructing a test of where you sit within that continuum and whether you want to really directly assess it or more indirectly. As mentioned before about norm reference, so you have and this is actually, there's not really a continuum, it's either norm referenced or it's continuum reference, and that is what is the standard for overall evaluation. So for norm reference, as I mentioned previously, you measure with respect to some large group of people, and they try to have like items designed with a range of difficulty to create a spread. So the idea is that you want a distribution of scores. You want a large distribution. You want to be able to discriminate between different learners, between those who are really, know the content well and those who don't. So the idea is that you have items that really create a spread, and there's a spread of scores. Also, norm reference is the idea that it assesses students based on how their score relates to the average student. So this is very typical in standardized tests, so NAPLAN scores, where you have, there's an average kind of score and it shows where you sit within the larger population. Criterion reference is the idea that you're measured in respect to some objective or objectives, and the items selected match the objective. So for this unit, we have a rubric, and those are specific things that need to be, you need to show that you can do that particular objective or criterion, and the rubric is set up in that way. So it is criterion referenced. The last kind of distinction when creating tests and this is another continuum from objective to more subjective, which is how is the item or task scored. Now, when you're thinking of objective, there's explicit guidelines for scoring, established set of right answers. So it goes to that there's one right answer. There's not much skill or personal judgment required on the part of the score, so it can be scored by a computer, but there's not a lot of personal judgment. And that's, for example, multiple choice. There's one correct answer. It's not too difficult to score. Now, then there's more subjective ways of scoring a task, and that scoring relies on implicit standards, so they're not as clear, and it requires some personal judgment. And the scoring requires skill. So, and that's something like an essay. So, for example, in this unit, and it should be most of your units that you take here at university, we have moderation. And that requires all of the tutors or lecturers to get together and to look at the rubric, because even though we try to make the rubric very explicit in what we are assessing, even just one little word can mean something different to another person. So we establish what does that actually mean, and we look at different examples of students' work, and we just say, well, where does this fit? And we try to kind of create this, understanding among us that what does an HG look like? What does this look like? And try to very, very much establish that, so that as we can be more, I guess, objective, but in certain things like essays, it is a subjective process. So we do try to kind of create these processes that ensure that we are trying to be as fair, and the scoring is more reliable through these processes. All right, that is the end of this lecture. In tutorials, you'll get some practice in constructing some tests and getting some feedback, both peer and through your tutors as you go through that process. Hopefully now you are considering and you are thinking about your first assignment and how you're going to go about doing that and starting to get started with that. Have a fabulous week, and we'll see you in tutorials.